On the Cypress Bend plantation by the Bayou Teche, beneath the swollen sun of sugar country, cruelty was staged like theater. Joseph knelt in the dirt that day, 30 years old, wrists raw from the forge, shoulders scarred by the mill. His skin glistened with sweat, his back bent not from age, but from years of carrying iron and cane beneath a sky that refused mercy. The overseer Pike towered above him, leather boots sunk into the mud, whip dangling loose like a serpent waiting to strike. Around them, William Carter's guests gathered in a semicircle, men in pale linen suits, wives in hoop skirts swatting away flies, their laughter spilling as freely as the rum they sipped. They had come to Cypress Bend not merely for business, but for spectacle, to watch one man's dominion over another displayed as if it were sport. To them, suffering was proof of wealth, the lash a language of authority. Pike's voice cracked the air. Too slow. He paced around Joseph like a dog circling prey, spit glistening in the corner of his mouth. He forced the blacksmith to both knees, pressing him down with one hand on his neck, grinding his face into the dust. When Joseph did not resist, when he let silence be his only reply, Pike spat on him, thick, wet, deliberate so that the overseer's contempt clung to his cheek in the heat. The crowd roared with amusement. "See here," Pike drawled, addressing the masters who stood behind him. "This one thinks himself too good for the lash. But a body that forgets its place must be reminded." The whip snapped, once, twice, a third time. Each crack across Joseph's shoulders was not punishment for a crime, but choreography. A demonstration to the visiting planters that Cypress Bend remained a house where order was carved into flesh. The women gasped theatrically. The men smirked and nodded approval, as though they were witnessing fine horsemanship at the races. William Carter himself stood at the center of the gathering, a heavy-set man whose cane harvests no longer paid his debts. Yet his pride was unbent, and he clung to cruelty as a mask for weakness. Carter's eyes were bludged from whiskey, but his posture remained upright, one hand resting on his cane carved from mahogany, the other on his son Edwin's shoulder. The the young man watched with tight lips, his gaze darting between his father and Joseph's bent figure. Edwin was being groomed for inheritance and for marriage, promised to Eliza Harlan, daughter of a neighboring planter family. The union was no romance, it was collateral, a desperate hope that dowry land and slaves might prop up Carter's faltering empire. The overseer's lash struck again. Joseph's muscles tensed under the blows, but he refused to cry out. The silence unsettled Pike more than a scream would have. He struck harder, faster, each snap echoing over the cane fields where other enslaved workers had paused to watch, heads lowered but eyes burning. William Carter raised his glass of rum, his voice loud and smug. "Gentlemen, you see discipline, order, obedience. These are the foundations of prosperity." His guests applauded with murmurs of approval, but prosperity was a lie. The truth was visible in the thinning cane, the rusting boilers of the sugar mill, the ledgers swollen with red ink. Cypress Bend survived not on bounty, but on debt and spectacle. When the land could not yield enough, Carter squeezed flesh instead. He cut rations, he staged public humiliations, he paraded his dominion to hide the cracks in his fortune. The sun pressed down, heavy as iron, baking the ground until it reeked of cane rot and sweat. Joseph's breath came in ragged pulls, but his silence held. Inwardly, he replayed every sound. The crack of the whip, the laughter of Carter's guests, Pike's spit striking his face as though each humiliation was being etched into memory. Carter's wife, Margaret, fanned herself beneath the veranda, her face pale but untroubled. She whispered to another woman about lace from New Orleans, while her husband's overseer carved red lines into Joseph's back. Edwin stood nearby, watching with something like unease, though he said nothing. His silence was complicity, his lips sealed by the weight of his father's expectations and the promise of his arranged marriage. The moment stretched long. Dust clung to Joseph's tongue. The cicadas in the cane fields screamed louder than the whip, a relentless chorus of suffering too vast to silence. Sweat stung his eyes, salt mixing with Pike's spit, and the taste of it burned like shame. But he would not bow lower. He would not beg. When Pike finally stepped back, panting from his own exertion, Carter raised a hand as if granting pardon from a throne. "That will do. Let them see who commands here." The overseer sneered and pushed Joseph's head down one final time before releasing him. Laughter rippled through the guests, their amusement already turning to boredom as they drifted back toward the veranda, seeking shade and fresh glasses of rum. To them, Joseph was nothing but another body bent, another reminder of the system that kept their own wealth secure. Joseph rose slowly, his back burning, his knees aching in the dirt. He did not meet Pike's eye. He did not meet Carter's either. Instead, he looked outward past the veranda, past the smirking faces, past the cane fields shimmering in the heat. His gaze found the horizon where the cypress trees bent low over the bayou, their roots twisted like clenched fists. There, for the briefest moment, his silence hardened into something else. The humiliation had been meant to break him. Instead, it was stored like gunpowder, waiting for a spark. And though no one watching that day knew it, Joseph's silence was not surrender. It was a vow. The summer of 1847 deepened, heavy with mosquitoes and the sour reek of boiling cane. The punishment yard grew quiet after Joseph's humiliation, but memory has a way of fermenting. Days later, another cruelty ripened. Sarah, 16 years old, Joseph's younger sister, small enough to have once hidden in the hollow of a sugar barrel, still tender enough that her laugh could soften the nights in the quarters. She was no threat, no rebel, no thief. Her crime was this: she dropped a tray of glassware in the big house. Crystal shattering on the floor was all it took. William Carter, swollen with debt and rum, declared she was spoiled. He summoned a trader riding through Bayou Teche and sold her down to sugar for a fraction of her worth. Down to sugar, words that froze blood colder than chains. Everyone knew what it meant. In the deeper parishes, the cane fields ate men alive. The mills ground bodies with as little mercy as stalks of cane. To be sent there was not exile, it was a sentence. Few returned, and those who did bore scars that spoke louder than sermons. Joseph had no chance to say goodbye. Sarah was taken in the night, her arms bound, her cries muffled against the darkness. By morning, her name was an absence in the quarters, a hollow at every fire pit. The other slaves whispered prayers. Joseph did not pray. He sat silent, fists pressed to his knees, his jaw locked so hard it ached. Rebecca, his mother, did not survive the blow. She was past 50, bent from decades in the fields, her skin creased like the bark of the cypress. For years, she had carried baskets of cane until her spine bowed like a reed. That week, her body gave out. She collapsed beside the boiling vats, hands blackened from ash, breath shallow. No overseer carried her inside. She was left to crawl until Joseph lifted her in his arms and laid her on a pallet. Her chest rattled like a loose chain. She whispered Sarah's name once, then fell into a fevered silence. That night, Joseph knelt beside her, not as Pike had forced him to, but by choice. He pressed his forehead to the dirt floor and made a vow. Never again would he beg, never again would he plead for mercy. He would carry each humiliation like a stone, building something out of silence that the Carters could never imagine. Every lash, every sale, every broken promise would be kept in memory, sharpened until the time came to use it. The forge gave him more than scars, it gave him knowledge. By day he hammered iron hinges, wagon parts, the cruel hooks used in the mill. By night he studied fire, air, and powder. Saltpeter crusted along the barrels in the storehouse. Sulfur drifted from the refinery. Coal dust clung to his skin until he could taste it on his tongue. No master understood how close the tools of empire were to the tools of destruction. But Joseph saw. The sugar mill was his second teacher. Its boilers, its locked doors, its vents groaning beneath the mansion all demanded repair. He learned their weaknesses, how hinges gave way if struck at the right point, how steam escaped through hidden grates beneath the house. He crawled the underground chambers with hammer and torch, memorizing the veins that ran beneath the Carter mansion. While Pike cursed his slowness, Joseph counted steps in silence, mapping escape routes and opportunities alike. Every humiliation he stored became calculation. He watched the overseer's keys, learned the rhythm of guard shifts, the way Pike drank himself insensible by midnight. He listened when the traders bragged of shipments, when creditors muttered about Carter's debts. He fixed the locks that secured the cellars, but in his mind he unlocked everyone. Rebecca lingered a few weeks before her breath failed. She died without Sarah, without freedom, without even a coffin, just a shallow grave near the quarters, marked by a stone Joseph set himself. He did not weep where others could see. But in the forge, when sparks leapt against his skin, his silence deepened into something harder than grief. The world around him did not change. Carter cut rations again, declaring that debt must be repaid with discipline. Guests still arrived to drink and watch demonstrations of cruelty. Edwin's marriage negotiations continued. The Harlan family paraded through the estate like creditors come to inspect collateral. The air smelled of roasted pig and cane, but beneath it lay rot of land, of money, of souls. Yet Joseph changed. He walked through Cypress Bend no longer as a victim, but as a ledger of injuries, each entry demanding balance. His eyes no longer lowered when Pike barked. Instead, they fixed on the overseer with the patience of a man memorizing a face for later reckoning. The quarters began to notice. Old men by the fire pit said Joseph's silence was different now. The women whispered that his shadow seemed longer, his steps heavier, as if he carried not tools but judgment. He did not deny it. He let their whispers grow. Knowledge and grief fused inside him like molten iron cooling into steel. The lash, the sale of Sarah, the death of Rebecca. These were not merely wounds. They were fuel. And in that fuel, the first sparks of vengeance glowed. Sunday afternoons at Cypress Bend carried a fragile illusion of mercy. After the bells of the Plantation chapel rang, masters and mistresses reclined in parlors while their slaves were herded into crude worship. For William Carter, it was a convenient arrangement. Slaves singing hymns were less likely to plot rebellion. But for Joseph, Sunday was the only time whispers could travel undisturbed, folded into prayers and songs. He stood at the back of the chapel, calloused hands folded as if in piety, and let his lips move with the others. The hymn's words rose like smoke, but beneath them ran another language, quiet exchanges in fragments, syllables cut short to slip past white ears. From the next plantation came Thomas, a stable hand with shoulders broad from years of breaking horses. From another came Lucy, a cook with eyes like burning coals, who carried gossip and scraps in equal measure. They sang as commanded, but between verses Joseph murmured questions, and answers returned like tides. Cane harvest light this year. Master's debts grow heavier. 2 sold last week. But also powder moved with shipments of salt. Fertilizer barrels left uncounted. Locks rusting on Harlan's storehouse. Information gathered in whispers became a map. The slaves of Bayou Teche did not need parchment. Memory was their paper, silence their ink. Lucy became Joseph's most vital ally. As cook, she handled shipments of flour, molasses, and lard. Inside sacks of meal, she tucked handfuls of sulfur scraped from the edge of the boiling vats. She disguised them as spilled spice, letting the overseer's nose dismiss the acrid tang. Thomas, with access to the stables, smuggled coal dust in feed sacks hidden beneath the smell of hay. Together they moved what they could, never too much at once, never enough to raise suspicion, but steadily, like drops filling a jar. Joseph hid the contraband in the bowels of the sugar mill. Repairing boilers gave him excuse to crawl into corners where even Pike's boots rarely ventured. There, in the damp dark, he arranged sacks of powder behind iron grates, covering them with scraps of cane. He worked slowly, testing mixtures at the forge, watching how saltpeter flared, how coal lengthened flame, how sulfur thickened smoke. Each experiment he committed to memory, never on paper, for written words were dangerous in a land where literacy itself was treated as rebellion. The mill itself became his tutor. He repaired locks with hands that memorized their weaknesses. He opened and closed furnace doors until he could do so in silence. Crawling through the underground passages that connected the mill to the mansion's wine cellars, he traced hidden vents that carried heat into the Carter home. He counted each step from cellar to parlor, each turn where the walls sweated with steam. He saw how easily fire, if coaxed, could move unseen beneath the great house. The Carter family remained blind. They believed their discipline unshakable. William swaggered before his creditors, promising that Edwin's marriage to Eliza Harlan would redeem his debts. He paraded his son at suppers, showing him off as if he were not merely an heir, but a commodity polished for exchange. The engagement party was announced for late autumn, a feast to prove Carter prosperity before neighbors and lenders alike. Joseph listened. Each plan for the party was another stone in his foundation. Margaret Carter ordered barrels of sugar and rum for the event. William demanded fresh polish on silver and new uniforms for the house slaves. Pike barked that the quarters must be scrubbed spotless, as if filth itself could tarnish the Carter name. Amid the bustle, Joseph's silence made him invisible. He moved between forge, mill, and cellar, shaping hinges, fixing doors, carrying powder in handfuls disguised as ash. The closer the party came, the clearer his design became. He would not wield a blade, he would wield fire and air, the very breath of the earth. He collected powder into barrels, mixing sugar dust with saltpeter until the air itself became combustible. Each step was masked by labor. To the overseer he was mending, to the Carters he was useful. Only to himself did he confess the truth that he was building a judgment no whip could stop. Still, he needed a signal. For a crime of this scale, secrecy was survival. He and his allies decided on a hymn roll, Jordan roll. Sung in unison during the engagement feast, it would cover the scratch of flint and the hiss of fuse. To the masters, it would sound like obedience. To the slaves, it would be thunder disguised as prayer. Joseph prepared the charge in the final days before the party. He lowered barrels into the cellar beneath the parlor, covering them with sacks of cane. He laced a fuse along the stone floor, thin as rope but steady, hidden where only his hands would search. He tested its path twice, crawling like a shadow beneath the house, listening for creaks, memorizing each breath of air. When it burned in his tests, it hissed like a serpent, a sound he swore would one day rise into flame. The eve of the party came with an air of brittle festivity. Cypress Bend buzzed with preparations, garlands hung along the veranda, fiddlers arrived to tune instruments, wagons delivered barrels of wine and flour. Edwin dressed in finery, his collar starched, his hair slicked with oil. He looked not like a groom, but like a prize paraded for auction, his future tethered to Eliza Harlan's dowry. Margaret rehearsed her greetings. William rehearsed his toast. Pike rehearsed his cruelty, lashing two boys for failing to scrub the steps clean enough for his eye. In the quarters, silence reigned. Lucy whispered that the meal was prepared. Thomas whispered that the horses were restless, their ears catching some storm in the air. And Joseph, crouched in the forge, whispered to himself the litany of names he carried. Sarah, Rebecca, all those whose lives had been ground to dust so the Carters could pour rum for their guests. The fuse was set. The barrels waited. The hymn was agreed upon. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, and Joseph, scarred, humiliated, bereaved, walked into the night, knowing the house above him would not survive the dawn of its own celebration. The night of the engagement feast arrived with an air of triumph. Lanterns hung from the veranda of the Carter mansion, their glow casting trembling halos against whitewashed walls. The cypress trees along the bayou swayed in the humid breeze as wagons rattled into the yard, bearing guests dressed in silk and linen, their laughter carrying across the fields like the sound of coins tumbling onto a table. William Carter greeted them with swollen pride, his coat tight across his stomach, his smile forced but steady. Beside him, Margaret fluttered like a nervous sparrow, instructing servants to carry shawls, to collect hats, to pour glasses of rum. Edwin stood polished in new boots, a starched collar that pinched his throat, and an expression that hovered uneasily between boy and groom. Eliza Harlan, pale and thin, descended from her father's carriage with practiced grace, her dowry whispered about more loudly than her beauty. The parlor blazed with candlelight, silver gleamed on long tables laden with roast pig, pies, and sugared fruits. Fiddlers scraped their bows, filling the air with reels and waltzes. Voices rose in toasts of land, of unions, of debts disguised as prosperity. Beneath it all, unseen, the cellars held their secret, barrels of powder and sugar dust. A serpent's breath curled tight, waiting only for the spark Joseph had prepared. He moved quietly through the house, his hands carrying trays, his eyes lowered. To the Carters and their guests, he was invisible, a shadow in livery. Yet inside, every movement pulsed with purpose. He checked the cellar door once more, ensuring the fuse lay hidden along the stone. His calloused fingers brushed it lightly, as if touching the edge of a blade. At the appointed moment, Lucy began the hymn. Her voice rose from the kitchen, soft at first, then joined by other slaves serving at table, carrying platters, pouring wine. Roll, Jordan, roll. To the guests it was nothing more than a pleasant spiritual, a reminder of loyalty from those they owned. But for Joseph it was thunder disguised as song. He slipped into the cellar with a lantern shielded in his palm. The hymn filled the air above, voices swelling, stomping the rhythm into the wooden floor. He crouched by the barrels, struck flint, and coaxed the fuse to life. It caught with a hiss, red like a coal, racing into the dark. His heart beat steady. Not fast, not panicked, steady. He turned, climbed the stairs, and slipped back into the night. Outside, the barn stood quiet, shadows of horses shifting inside. Joseph raised his voice for the first time that night. "Fire in the barn." The cry cut through music and laughter. Workers leapt from their posts, rushing to save animals and feed. Overseer Pike barked orders, grabbing a torch, stumbling in drunken haste toward the stables. In the confusion, Joseph vanished into the cane fields, his body swallowed by rustling stalks. Moments later, the hymn ended. The toast began. William Carter lifted his glass, his voice booming through the parlor. "To the future of Cypress Bend, to the union of our families, to the prosperity of Louisiana." Crystal clinked. Guests raised glasses. Edwin smiled weakly at his bride-to-be. And then the house roared. The explosion tore upward with the fury of a storm bottled too long. The cellar burst, stone trembling, floorboards shattering. Flames leapt through vents like tongues unleashed. Glass windows shattered outward, shards spraying across the veranda. Guests screamed as the parlor ceiling split, raining plaster and smoke. The Carter mansion, proud and hollow, folded in upon itself with a sound that shook the cane fields. From the distance of the bayou, slaves paused in their work, heads lifting as the night bloomed orange. They watched silently as the house that had stood above them like a crown now burned like a pyre. Inside, chaos devoured order. William Carter was thrown against the wall, his glass still clutched in his hand as flames consumed his coat. Margaret's shrieks vanished beneath the crash of timber. Edwin stumbled, reaching for Eliza, only to vanish beneath the falling chandelier. Guests crawled through smoke, clawing at the floor, their finery turned to rags of ash. Outside, Pike shouted accusations. "Runaways! Rebels!" His voice cracked with panic as he searched for footprints, but the night betrayed nothing. The heavens opened, rain spilling hard and sudden, washing away tracks in mud, blurring every clue. The cane fields hissed under the downpour, swallowing the sound of Joseph's retreat. By dawn, the Carter mansion was a skeleton, beams blackened, walls collapsed. Among the ruins, bodies lay twisted, their wealth reduced to cinders. Debt papers stored in the study had burned to ash. What creditors found in the rubble was nothing but smoke and silence. The official story spread quickly. Slaves had run, slaves had burned, slaves had plotted. But the truth was more dangerous. No one saw Joseph light the fuse. No one saw him vanish into the cane. He became both ghost and rumor, his name whispered in quarters across the bayou. Fear spread faster than fire. Planters ordered new precautions. Slaves must taste every dish before it touched a white mouth. Routines must change daily, night guards posted in kitchens and stables. They armed themselves not against armies, but against the very hands that fed and clothed them. Trust fractured. Masters flinched when their slaves sang hymns, no longer certain whether it was worship or warning. The Carters were dead, their debts erased not by inheritance but by flame. Cypress Bend became a ruin, its name spoken with unease, its story carried by those who had witnessed smoke rising over Bayou Teche. And Joseph, though unseen, had carved his vow into history. Not with cries, not with pleas, but with fire that turned a mansion into memory. The ruins of Cypress Bend smoldered for days, charred beams jutted like broken ribs against the sky. Vultures circled overhead, settling on the blackened veranda where once William Carter had raised his glass. The bayou carried ash on its surface, drifting past cypress roots like fragments of a drowned empire. Joseph was gone. No one had seen him since the night of the feast. Pike swore he had glimpsed a shadow fleeing into the cane, but the rain erased every track, every trace. Posses scoured the swamps, dogs sniffed along the levees, patrols combed the roads. They found nothing. The man who had knelt in dust and endured spit and lash had vanished, leaving only silence and fire. In the quarters of Bayou Teche, his name began to stir, not shouted, not proclaimed, but whispered by firelight when the overseers slept. Mothers told their children of the man who had endured humiliation, who had seen his sister sold, his mother buried, and who had turned silence into vengeance. They called it the Bayou Teche explosion, but among the enslaved it became scripture, proof that the big house was not untouchable, that the whip was not eternal. Fear spread faster than the story itself. Across Louisiana, masters ordered servants to sip from every cup before they drank. Cooks were watched with eyes sharp as knives. Keys to cellars were doubled, routines shuffled, hymns interrupted. Some banned singing altogether, unable to hear a spiritual without thinking of sparks crawling through hidden fuses. They tightened chains, but it was too late. Suspicion had already poisoned their tables. The enslaved drew strength from it. In fields and kitchens, new acts of sabotage unfolded. Gears loosened in sugar mills, harvest wagons overturned, barrels of cane spoiled by saltwater accidents. None matched the scale of Cypress Bend, but each carried its echo. Workers spoke of Joseph as if he were still walking among them. his silence a cloak that hid him from capture. Some claimed to see him by the bayou at dusk, standing unburned among the ruins, a lantern in his hand, eyes fixed on the horizon. Newspapers called it madness, the work of demons, a warning against leniency, but in the quarters they called it memory. They said Joseph had not disappeared. He had become a shadow that walked behind every overseer, a spark waiting in every hearth. His story traveled upriver to Baton Rouge, downriver to New Orleans, across parishes like a hymn no lash could silence. Cypress Bend never rose again. The land was sold in parcels, the mansion's ruins swallowed slowly by vines and silence. Yet the tale remained. The man who had endured humiliation and turned it into fire lived on, not in flesh, but in the whispers of those still bound. His vow never to beg, never to bow outlived him, passed like contraband through generations. And so Joseph became more than a slave, more than a man. He became a warning carved into memory, a spark carried in song. A reminder that silence can hide fire, and that fire once lit can consume empires.